Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm recording, so that should be good. Yeah, today we're going to finish up talking about competition and the other two species interactions that we haven't covered yet, commensalism and mutualism. And then we'll have a little bit of time, I think, to start communities as well. So yeah, thanks again for adjusting your schedules. For those of you who could make it, looks like attendance is way lower than it was before, unfortunately. But yeah, if you're watching this in the future, hello from the past. I'll be on office hours from that Zoom meeting from 3 o'clock till 3:30. So yeah, you can watch at the normal class time and join that Zoom meeting if you have any questions for me. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the slideshow here. Okay, so last time we were talking about this Lotka-Volterra competition model, and what we had covered so far with that model is basically all these different outcomes could happen in the model based on these two isoclines, the isocline for species 1 and the isocline for species 2. Whether they intersect with each other and how they intersect with each other depends on the relative sizes of all of those different X and Y intercepts there. And so yeah, you can predict what's going to happen if there's going to be a winner of competition, or if they're going to stably coexist, or if there's going to be alternative stable states, priority effects, depending on the isoclines and how they how they are oriented relative to each other. All right, and we learned, like we were really focused on this specific situation where the two species coexist. And we learned that that happens in this set of scenarios. So these are the X and Y intercepts and how their relative sizes. So when K2 over beta is greater than K1, and when K1 over alpha is greater than K2, that's when the species are predicted to stably coexist. And again, as I mentioned, that's kind of the impetus for creating that model, is trying to figure out, okay, we know that things can drive each other to extinction with competition, so why do we see so many things coexisting in nature? Is this specific scenario where species coexist, is this a common scenario? And that's kind of explaining why we see so many competitors coexisting in nature. All right, so yeah, let's take a look at the scenario and see whether or not it's common, and sort of talk about like what kinds of interactions will result in this set of X and Y intercepts that I'm showing you here. All right, so yeah, we've got those inequalities there. You can actually rearrange them. If you noticed, there's this relationship K1 and K2 in both of those inequalities. You can actually solve both of those inequalities for K1 over K2, and then combine those inequalities into a single inequality there at the bottom. So this rearranged inequality here is the same thing. So these X and Y intercepts right here have been rearranged to be a single inequality here at the bottom. So yeah, just some algebra. And yeah, so the species are going to coexist when alpha is less than K1 over K2, which is less than 1 over beta. Okay, so let's think about what that means. So we know that the alphas and betas, those are the competition coefficients. It's like a measure of how strongly the competitor, the other species affects each other versus your own species affecting you. And so alpha is the effect of species 2 on species 1. Beta is the effect of species 1 on species 2. And if alpha equals 1, that means that individuals of N2 and N1 are equivalent for N1's population dynamics. So that means if you're an N1 individual, it doesn't matter whether you're competing with another N1 individual or an N2 individual, a species 1 or a species 2, it basically will affect your population growth, your birth rates and death rates and all that the same. And that's if alpha equals 1. Similarly, if beta equals 1, that means individuals of N2 and N1 are equivalent for N2's population dynamics. So yeah, species 2 would be affected by another species 2 or a species 1 equally if beta equals 1. All right, And what about when these competition coefficients are greater than 1? That means that individuals of the opposite species hurt each, hurt the same species more than individuals of its own species do. So interspecific competition is actually stronger than intraspecific competition if these competition coefficients are greater than 1. If the competition coefficients are less than 1, that means that individuals of the opposite species hurt each species less than individuals of its own species do. So that means interspecific competition is not as strong as intraspecific competition. We already talked a little bit about the relative strength of intraspecific competition and interspecific competition, and we concluded that intraspecific competition tends to be very strong, and that's because members of your own species have the same exact resource requirements. They live in the same places, they get resources the same way and everything. So yeah, that intraspecific competition tends to be stronger than interspecific competition. So members of your own species tend to affect each other more than members of other species do. And so the situation right here at the bottom with these competition coefficients being less than 1, that is common, like we commonly see that in nature. Does that lead to more coexistence among competitors? Let's take a look and see if that's the case. So here again is that inequality that's showing the situation where the species are predicted to stably coexist. So let's just say, what if these competition coefficients are equal to 1? Alpha equals beta equals 1. If you pay attention to this formula here, if we substitute in those numbers here, so now we've got 1 over here, we've got 1 over 1 over here, and so basically you can see that that inequality is impossible. And so coexistence is not possible if these species are affecting each other exactly the same way, if the competition coefficients are both 1. And you can also see that if the competition coefficients are greater than 1, it makes it even worse. So like here, if they were both 1, then the inequality just doesn't really work. I mean, these are greater than signs, not like greater than or equal to signs, so you can't have anything in between 1 and 1 here. So it can't work if they're 1. If these are greater than 1, you can see that that makes this number higher than 1, and that makes this number lower than 1. 1 over beta would make this lower than 1, and so that makes it even worse. We want alpha to be smaller than 1 over beta. And so yeah, having alpha greater than 1 or beta greater than 1 makes it even worse. The species are not predicted to coexist if alpha and beta are greater than 1 also. So in order for competing species to coexist in this model, alpha and beta must be less than 1. And that means intraspecific competition has to be stronger than interspecific competition. And as we mentioned, that is the case in nature many times. If you go out and measure the effect of competition, intraspecific competition and interspecific competition, how does that kind of competition affect individual growth rates and population growth rates? We often see that intraspecific competition is stronger. And so that's sort of encouraging, I guess, if you're interested in diversity and competitors coexisting. The fact that intraspecific competition is usually stronger than interspecific competition is a good thing. That means that species are more likely to coexist. There's a famous paper that I'll sort of cite here that kind of goes through the different ways that competitors might coexist with each other, different forces that might contribute to competitors coexisting. And yeah, this paper, theoretical paper by Peter Chesson in 2000. And there are basically two scenarios that Chesson pointed out would lead to increased chances of competitors coexisting. One is when each species affects each other more strongly than it affects the other species, which is what we're showing here. And he called those stabilizing factors. And so yeah, the fact that intraspecific competition is often greater than interspecific competition, that's a stabilizing factor. And anything that promotes competition within a species being stronger than competition between species is something that's going to be stabilizing here in Chesson's framework. All right, so this is one aspect of species coexistence in this model, is the relative sizes of these competition coefficients, how they compare to 1. One thing that we haven't talked about yet, which involves the middle of this inequality, is the carrying capacities of both species, the K1 and the K2. So let's look at another scenario here. Using the same inequality, alpha less than K1 over 2 less than 1 over beta. What if we consider a situation where competition is really strong? So alpha equals beta equals 0.95. So this is like each species affects each other more strongly than it affects the other species. However, it's quite strong competition. You have like about 95% of the effect of competition when it's the other species versus your own species. That's what this alpha equals beta equals 0.95 is saying. Okay, so say we have that number. Can the species coexist? So yeah, if we substitute in that 0.95 for alpha and beta in that inequality, we get 0.95 is less than K1 over K2, which is less than 1.05. You can see that this will work if K1 over K2 is very close to 1. So if it falls between 0.95 and 1.05. And so in order for K1 over K2 to be very close to 1, that means that they have to be very similar to each other. So K1 and K2 must be very close to one another in order for that ratio of their of K1 over K2 to be close to 1. So the prediction here, if there's really strong competition, interspecific competition, but still slightly less strong than intra, coexistence will only happen if K1 and K2 are very similar and that ratio is very close to 1. So Peter Chesson called anything that makes these species carrying capacities more equivalent to each other, he called these equalizing factors. And so, yeah, the two kinds of things that control whether species that are competing coexist with each other are the equalizing factors and the stabilizing factors. And there are two pretty different kinds of forces. The equalizing factors are saying, okay, these species are similar to each other in terms of their carrying capacities. What is their final population size when they're growing alone in their environment? And so, yeah, the equalizing factors are something that the species have in common with each other, whereas the stabilizing factors, those are things that make the competition coefficients less than 1. There are things that cause the species to maybe be using resources slightly different than each, the two species are using resources slightly differently. And that means that they're going to affect each other more than they affect the other species. And so it's kind of something that's a difference in their resource use that's contributing to stabilizing factors. And so, yeah, kind of two different forces result in coexistence in this model. One that's causing them to be similar in their carrying capacities. One of them that's causing them to be different in their resource use, such that intraspecific competition is stronger than interspecific competition. So yeah, pretty strange outcome here in this model, but yeah, we do expect these two forces, the stabilizing forces and the equalizing forces, to both be important in controlling whether competitors coexist with each other. Okay, so let's think about some of these scenarios in a little bit more detail here. So we had those stabilizing factors that cause intraspecific competition to be stronger than interspecific competition. We've covered a little bit about evolutionary responses to competition, and one thing that we focused on is this idea of niche partitioning, where species that have a lot of resource overlap, so they're using resources similarly, they evolve to specialize on part of the resource so that they're not competing as much. And so that's shown here. We've got size of prey on the x-axis here, and we can see that This is like preference or frequency of feeding for two different predators here on the y-axis. So we've got species 1 in red and species 2 in black. You can see there's a lot of overlap in terms of the size of prey that they prefer to eat. Niche partitioning is a hypothesis that says, okay, they should evolve to have less resource overlap over time. And so, yeah, over evolutionary time, as they specialize on different aspects of the resource here, size of prey, we've got the red ones shifting to the left to prefer smaller prey items, and the black ones shifting to the right to prefer bigger prey items. And you can see there's a lot less overlap in terms of how they're competing with each other. So this will be competition right here in this overlapping section. Those are the prey that they're competing for. And you can see that there's much more competition initially than there is after evolution causes niche partitioning. And so, yeah, this niche partitioning is something that really allows competitors to coexist in a lot of cases, because it contributes to less resource overlap among the two species, and therefore greater chances that intraspecific competition is stronger than interspecific competition. So we've got weaker interspecific competition as a result of niche partitioning, and that's expected to increase the chances that competitors can coexist with each other. Okay, so that is it for competition. Let me stop the PowerPoint for just a second and open it up to any questions. Any questions about competition, about these models, about the theory? I'll open up the chat just in case. All right, looks like there aren't any questions. So let's go back. Okay, so now we're pretty much done talking about all of these other kinds of species interactions except for these last two. So we've talked about competition, just finished that up today. And then we've already covered predation, herbivory, parasitism, and disease, these exploitative interactions in the middle. So the only interactions we have left to talk about now are mutualism and commensalism. So let's talk about those a little bit. I'll say there's a lot less theory that's been done on these other kinds of interactions than on these more antagonistic interactions that we've covered already. However, there is increasing recognition that mutualism and commensalism are very important as well, and there's a lot more modeling stuff kind of currently being done versus what was done in the past. So in the past, for whatever reason, ecologists focused on these predator-prey interactions and competition. But these positive interactions, mutualism and commensalism, are very important as well, and they can have similar effects on things like coevolution and community dynamics and that kind of thing. But yeah, there's a lot less theory. We're not going to cover any models of these positive interactions for that reason. But yeah, currently a lot more people are working on these kinds of interactions now. All right, so let's talk about those. First, just a few definitions. So mutualism is an interaction between individuals or species that's mutually beneficial. So both members of the interaction get some benefit from the interaction. Commensalism is when you have two individuals or two species interacting where one species benefits and the other isn't affected. So it's a +0 interaction. Often commensalisms are something, mutualisms and commensalisms are symbioses, which means that the individuals of the two species are living in very close contact with each other, physiological contact. Often one organism is living inside of the other. So that's a symbiosis, when you've got this really strong interaction that results in the organisms kind of always living together. I'll say that not all mutualisms and commensalisms are symbioses. It's also really common for these kinds of interactions to be more facultative, and the members can kind of go their separate ways. And not all symbioses are mutualistic. There are certainly organisms that live in other organisms as a symbiosis that are not helpful, like pathogens, for example. You could call that a symbiosis as well. pathogens have to live inside of their hosts many times. But yeah, sometimes you get this symbiosis with mutualisms and commensalisms as well. Okay, so first let's talk about commensalism. This kind of interaction, this +0 interaction, is very common. So this is when one species is getting a benefit and the other is not affected. Here are 3 examples here. So on the left, there's a tree frog that's kind of using plants to blend in with its environment. So it's evolved to use these plants as its habitat, and its color is kind of blending in with the plants, and so it's using the plants as kind of protection. The frog that's interacting with plants is going to be eaten less than a frog that's like just on the ground, for example. So yeah, the frogs are getting a benefit by climbing around on these plants. Their survival is higher. However, the plants aren't getting any sort of benefit from this interaction or detriment. They're just kind of unaffected. And so yeah, that's one example, tree frogs blending into plants. Second example there, we've got these little egrets, these little white egrets. You may have seen these. They're actually found in Texas. And yeah, they're little heron-like birds that kind of hang out around cattle and horses, and so you'll find these little egrets running around in the grass around them or standing on their backs and that kind of thing. And this is another example of commensalism. The birds are getting a benefit from doing this. The cows or the horses are not really doing it, not really getting anything out of it. But yeah, what's happening is the egrets are using the cows to find food more easily. And so the egrets are eating little insects and things that are in these grasslands where the cows are eating. And as the cows are just moving through this grassland, they're scaring up a bunch of these insects. The insects fly away in response to the cows walking through the grass. And the cattle egrets use this as an opportunity to more easily find these insects and grab them as they're flying away from the cows. So yeah, egrets get a benefit, cows don't do anything. All right, and finally, we've got this jackal-tiger interaction there on the right. So yeah, the species of jackal, if they're alone, if they're not, so jackals can be pack hunters, but if you've got a lone individual, a lot of times it takes a different strategy where it follows a tiger and waits for the tiger to kill something and eat it, and then the jackal will come in and basically eat anything that the tiger didn't eat. And so, yeah, the jackal's getting a benefit from interacting with the tiger. The tiger's not really getting anything good or bad from that interaction. So yeah, these are all commensalism. Another famous example is this shark remora system. I'll show this video right quick. There's actually some question about whether this is a commensal interaction or a parasitic interaction. Let me make sure that the sound is going to play. And then I'll go to the video. Just loading here. All right.
No offense to the sea, but seriously, this image is getting darn near cliche. If fish hitches a ride on a shark or a whale, yeah, we got it. The fish is called a remora, but it's no cliche. It's actually far more fascinating than it lets on. If you guessed that the remora attaches to other creatures with suction, you'd be right. What you might not know is that the fish isn't suctioning with its mouth. The remora's suction cup is on the top of its noggin. Check it out. Nice hat, brah. That hat is its highly modified dorsal fin, the same fin you'd see a shark sticking out of the water. When the remora is born, the fin is on its back, where it's supposed to be, but migrates forward as the fish develops. As an adult, by attaching to larger fish and even marine mammals like dugongs, the remora not only gets a free ride to save energy, but also a free meal. If it's stuck to a carnivore like a shark, after an attack, it'll gobble up the clouds of flesh. With its less aggro hosts, it probably intercepts parasites that fall off their skin. Things like tiny crustaceans called copepods. The thing is, models show remoras can slow down their hosts significantly. That and they can end up rubbing their hosts raw. So while fish and rays don't seem to mind the remoras, these suckers might in fact be parasitic. Like, come on guys, ever heard of a personal bubble?
All right, so yeah, that's another kind of famous example of commensalism that may actually be parasitism instead. All right, going back. So that's it. That's all I have for commensalism. Let's switch to talking about mutualism. Yeah, so mutualism are these mutually beneficial interactions. They can be obligate versus facultative. So that means in obligate mutualisms, it's not optional. Both species sort of have to do this interaction in order to survive. In contrast to that, we have facultative mutualisms where it's not obligatory. The interaction is not really necessary for survival, but both species benefit, so you can still do it and get a benefit from it. But yeah, it doesn't really, it's not required for survival. In terms of the kinds of things that mutualists are getting from each other, so these are some common things that one species provides for another in a mutualism. So yeah, you can have trophic mutualisms, which involve exchange of energy or nutrients, food, that kind of thing. You can have habitat mutualisms where one species is providing shelter for another. You can have service mutualisms, which involve some sort of benefit that's like a process. So these are things like pollination, dispersal, and defense. And I would say that often the partners of a mutualism get different things from the interaction. So for example, a typical pollinator kind of mutualism, you've got the plant getting pollination service out of it, but you've got the animal, the thing that's doing the pollinating, getting some sort of trophic benefit, like eating nectar or eating pollen, that kind of thing. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that the organisms are kind of exchanging with each other. And yeah, whether a mutualism will take place depends on kind of the costs and benefits of the interaction. And so you've got mutualism when the benefits outweigh the costs for both species. And there is a cost associated with mutualism. So whenever you're exchanging goods like this, so like these mutual goods and services like mutualism entails, it requires some investment. So for example, a plant that's getting pollination services from an insect, it has to put some energy into making nectar and that kind of thing to attract those insects. So yeah, this is kind of an exchange of goods and services that's mutually beneficial, but it's going to depend on the relative costs and benefits of doing the interaction, whether it's a true mutualism or not. Some of these mutualisms are prone to kind of cheating, so I'll talk about that more in just a second. All right, just some examples of obligate mutualisms and facultative mutualisms. Here we've got an obligate mutualism between these leafcutter ants in the genus Atta. There's actually native species that you've probably seen if you've been walking around Austin for very long, Atta texana. But yeah, these leafcutter ants, they climb up on trees and shrubs and they cut little pieces of leaves and carry them back to their nests. And that's what you typically see these leafcutter ants doing, is carrying those leaves around back to from their tree or shrub that they're cutting back to their nest. It turns out that the ants are not eating the leaves themselves. What they're doing is they're chewing them up and putting them underground in their nest and cultivating a specific type of fungus, the leafcutter ant fungus. And this fungus is specific to leafcutter ants. The fungus is only found in the nests of leafcutter ants, and it's relying on the plant material, the kind of pre-chewed plant material that the ants are feeding it, The fungus needs that as its source of nutrition. And in return, the ants are actually eating the fungus. And so these ants are kind of like little farmers. They're taking plant material down into these nests and farming fungi with it. So kind of fertilizing the fungi, getting it to grow. And then that's what they're eating. They're eating the fungus. But yeah, this is a obligate mutualism. You only find the fungi in the nests of leafcutter ants, and the leafcutters only eat the fungus. That's their source of food. And so yeah, obligate mutualism. And when the ants are actually forming a new colony, like the queen flies and establishes a new colony, she actually takes a little bit of the fungus garden with her so she can propagate the fungus in her new nest. All right, here is another example involving ants of mutualism. In this case, it's mutualism between ants and a plant called an acacia. This is a kind of a thorny shrub. We have native acacias here in Texas, but this specific kind of acacia that houses ants is found in Africa and South America. But yeah, so in this case, we've got the ants and the tree, the acacia tree, involved in a mutualism together. The ants are housed in little structures on the thorns of the acacia plant. So the thorns have this little hole in them, and they're hollow inside, and the ants kind of nest in these little thorn houses that the plant is providing. The plant is also attracting ants with things called extrafloral nectaries. These are places where the plant is producing nectar outside of the flowers. And so, yeah, the ants are getting housing and getting a little bit of nutrition by living on the plants. In exchange, the plant is getting defense from herbivores. So there's all these little herbivorous insects that would come and even like mammals and things that would come and eat the leaves of this acacia tree. And the ants, when they realize that the tree is being attacked by something, the ants will actually attack the herbivore that's eating the acacia tree. And so the acacia is getting herbivory defense, whereas the ants are getting housing and food from this interaction. Yeah, another famous mutualism. This guy Dan Jansen has done a lot of work with this system. If you're interested, you can look up papers by him. Okay, and as I mentioned, the evolution of mutualism is a balance of costs and benefits. So yeah, you've got costs and benefits for both species in an interspecific mutualism here. And you get mutualism if the benefits outweigh the costs for both species. I should mention that this isn't altruism. Altruism is when an individual is behaving in a way that that benefits another at its own expense. And so that's like giving without expecting anything in return. That's altruism. In this case, mutualism is not altruism. Mutualism, both organisms are getting benefits, and it'll only be a mutualism if the benefits outweigh the costs for both species. Okay. Here are some common examples of mutualism. So here at top left, we've got these kinds of cleaning interactions, really common, especially in aquatic systems, but also things like oxpeckers and terrestrial systems as well. But yeah, this is a situation where one species kind of comes and cleans the parasites off of another. And so, yeah, the larger species is getting its parasites removed, whereas the smaller species is getting food for that in that interaction. At the top right, I'm showing mycorrhizal fungi. These are fungi associated with the roots of plants. And yeah, this is a really, really common kind of interaction. Almost 95% of plants species that have been studied for these have a fungus associated with their roots. And this is a mutualism where the fungus is actually getting some sugar from the plant. So some of the products of photosynthesis. So yeah, the fungus is getting carbon in the form of sugar from the plants. In exchange, the plants are getting kind of increased absorption from the soil as a result of these fungi. The fungi kind of grow in and around the roots of the plants. and kind of extend the reach of the roots of the plant, allowing them access to more soil nutrients and more soil water as well. So yeah, they're kind of increasing the surface area of the roots of the plants. And so yeah, the fungi are getting carbon in the form of sugar. The plants are getting water and nutrients, soil nutrients from this interaction. And this can actually be, so this is a really strong interaction. As I've said, lots of plants have these, and it's obligate for most of them. And so plants sometimes can't even grow if they don't have these fungi associated with their roots. So that can be why it's hard to get plants to grow from seeds in a lot of cases if they're in a different habitat than what they're used to, that's lacking these soil fungi. What else did I want to say? So this interaction, the plant is actually investing a lot in this interaction. It's like a lot of photosynthesis products are going to these fungi in their roots, actually, up to like 20% of what they're producing is going into feeding these fungi. But yeah, they're getting enough out of it that it's still a mutualism. Pollination here I'm showing on the bottom left, just a bunch of pollinators there on these daisies. And yeah, in these situations, the plant is getting pollination, so it's aiding dispersal of their gametes and crossbreeding to avoid inbreeding. Whereas the insects are getting some sort of reward, trophic reward, nectar or pollen that they're eating. And finally, we've got mutualisms involving microbes living in and on another organism. So yeah, these are the microbes are getting food out of this interaction, so and a habitat, housing, and so yeah, they're kind of feeding on the stuff that's in our skin and in our guts and that kind of thing. But it is a mutualism. They're helping us digest our food, getting more resources out in terms of gut bacteria. They're also preventing other more pathogenic strains of microbes from colonizing our skin and our guts as well. So yeah, that's another example of mutualism. All right, as I mentioned, mutualisms are kind of prone to cheating. So mutualisms can easily turn into competitive or other negative kinds of interactions, parasitism or predation, that kind of thing. And so yeah, the costs and benefits in a mutualism can change depending on the context and how much each species is actually contributing to the interaction and that kind of thing. And if a mutualism has been, established long enough for coevolution to take place, you can actually get the evolution of cheating prevention mechanisms in these kinds of interactions. And as an example of that, let's look at this situation with the plant a yucca and the moths that pollinate the yucca called yucca moths. And so yucca, you've probably seen, it's like this agave-like plant with really spiky leaves, and it sends up these flower stalks with these really beautiful white flowers, a big inflorescence of white flowers. And yeah, the yuccas are only pollinated by this group of moths called yucca moths. And you can see that the moths are eating the pollen, so that's kind of the benefit to the adult moths. You can see a moth here that has tons of yucca pollen in its mouth or in its palps right here. And so yeah, the moths are getting that pollen by eating it. They're also getting another benefit as well. The moths are laying eggs on the flowers of these yucca, and the caterpillars develop in the fruits of the yucca. So the yucca, if it gets pollinated, the flower withers and then it creates a fruit with the fertilized seeds, protecting the fertilized seeds there. And the yucca moths have laid eggs on those flowers as they're pollinating them. And the caterpillars are actually eating the seeds inside the fruit of the developing yucca fruits. And so yeah, the moths are getting trophic benefits from this interaction. The adults are eating the pollen and the caterpillars are eating the seeds of the plant. The yucca itself, though, is getting a benefit as well in that it's relying on these pollinators to fertilize its ovules, its gametes. And so it's spreading its gametes with these yucca moths, again, a specialist interaction. It's only these moths that are able to fertilize the yucca flowers. It turns out that the number of eggs that the the number of eggs that the adult moth is laying on the flowers, the yucca has kind of evolved a way of controlling that. And so here I'm showing percentage of flowers retained to maturity, and retained to maturity means that the flowers actually develop a fruit. And the x-axis here on this figure is number of moth eggs. And so, yeah, you can see if the moth lays 6 eggs or less in the on the flowers, then basically the flower is going to make a fruit. If the moth lays more than 6 eggs per flower, then what the plant does then is kind of aborting the flowers. So they probably did get pollinated. There were clearly moths on the flowers. However, the plant has evolved to basically not waste its energy in making a fruit if all the seeds are just going to be eaten by caterpillars. And so, yeah, if the moths lay more than 6 eggs per flower, then the plant just aborts those flowers, and they fall off without creating a fruit. And so yeah, you can see the percentage of flowers retained to maturity drops way off if the moth lays more than 6 eggs on it. This dotted line here is sort of the mean retention in the population. So this is kind of like the evolved level of how many flowers is the yucca going to keep. And yeah, you can see that it keeps more than that if the moth lays 6 eggs or fewer. And it really drops its flowers if the moth lays more than that. And so yeah, this is a cheating prevention mechanism that's evolved in the yucca. The yucca says, okay, if you're going to lay more than 6 eggs on my flowers, then I'm not going to give you the benefits to your caterpillars, and all of your eggs are going to die. And so yeah, the ones that lay lots of eggs, they have a selective disadvantage in this case because their caterpillars end up dying. The flower doesn't develop into a fruit, and so the caterpillars don't have a food source. So yeah, this is kind of evidence of kind of evolutionary punishment of cheaters in this case. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about mutualisms. I will end here by saying that mutualisms are very important for community structure, just like predator-prey interactions and competitive interactions. We could do models of mutualism where, you know, we show like the abundance of species one versus species 2 in a mutualism and see how that affects their population sizes and that kind of thing. We're not going to do that. Again, the theory is kind of behind with these positive interactions relative to these more negative interactions. But we know that mutualism is very important for things like population dynamics and interactions with other species and that kind of thing. In fact, mutualisms can actually expand the environment that's suitable for a species, such that the realized niche might actually be greater than the fundamental niche. As we mentioned before, the fundamental niche is like the range of abiotic conditions where a species can live, whereas the realized niche is where they actually live once you incorporate species interactions into that kind of equation there. But yeah, these mutualisms can actually expand the ranges of organisms such that they live in places that you wouldn't expect them to live otherwise. So yeah, and then mutualisms can also be particularly important for conservation of rare species as well, or endangered species. And that's because the persistence of these rare and endangered species is often dependent on mutualists for its continued survival. And so, for example, a rare plant is not going to do well if you're only conserving the plants and not also conserving its pollinators. And so a lot of conservation work requires conservation not just of a species directly, but also of all the other species that that organism is dependent on. And so yeah, there's a lot more sort of holistic conservation where we're trying to conserve entire intact ecosystems. The way that it works in the US is we have this legislation called the Endangered Species Act that kind of forces us to use individual species to try to provide the reasoning for conserving ecosystems. But yeah, the strategy of actually doing conservation is conserving the entire ecosystem, including all of the mutualists with the endangered species as well. Okay, so that is it for species interactions. Certainly let me know if you have any questions. If you have a question, it'll pop up in the chat. I won't stop the presentation yet. But yeah, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. It'll pop up and I'll open up the chat. But if you don't have any questions, we're going to move on to talking about communities. I'll just say so our third exam, the final exam, is as I mentioned, split into two. So we've got exam 3A and exam 3B. Exam 3A will only cover the species interactions. So up to chapter 15, I think it was the last chapter we covered. And so this next material is not going to be on exam 3A, it'll be in exam 3B. So this last slide here with mutualism is the last slide that's kind of relevant to exam 3A. And all of this other material will be on exam 3B. Okay, so yeah, let's start talking about communities. This is in chapter 16, the kind of intro to communities chapter in your textbook. And so community ecology is like the kind of the sum of all of these interactions that we've been talking about: predator-prey interactions, competition, mutualism, kind of all added up together for a given place. So communities are defined by a given place. You've got a community of organisms living in the same place. That's what's kind of defining communities. And so just thinking about some of the big questions in community ecology. One is sort of like, how are communities structured? Are species kind of co-evolved and dependent on each other such that you get a kind of super organism where communities are kind of like similar everywhere they occur? Or do you get species just kind of independently interacting with each other in the environment? And so a community is just kind of a chance sort of situation where all of these species just happen to be living in the same place at the same time. So yeah, how communities are structured, are they this kind of super organism or just individual things that are all just happening to be living in the same place? Other big questions in community ecology are understanding how species coexist. So we talked a little bit about that already with the competition modeling. But you can talk about that with other kinds of interactions as well. How does everything exist together with each other? Is it stable long term, or are these interactions kind of changing all the time? And then another thing that's similar to that is biodiversity. So understanding the diversity of species that live in a place and what controls that. So why are some places more diverse than others? And then how does this affect ecosystem services, especially the things that human society is getting from communities and ecosystems? So things like clean air, goods like lumber and food and medicine and that kind of thing. What's the role of diversity in providing human societies with different goods and services? All right. And finally, importance of species extinctions and introductions. So that's another big kind of community ecology area of study, is understanding what causes species to go extinct and what happens when non-native species are introduced to an area. All right, so some definitions. A community is a group of interacting species that occur together at the same place and time. I would say that it's a lot more theoretical than like a population or an individual or a species. Those things have, those things are also a little bit like you have to kind of define it before you can talk about it. But communities are even more theoretical. And in fact, often anyone that's doing community ecology, who's writing papers in community ecology, they're basically using their own definition of what their community is. And so each study is going to have its own kind of definition of what a community is. Often it's not every single species that's living in a place. It's often just some subset of species, or even just a couple of species that are interacting with each other in a community that ends up being the focus of a community ecology kind of study. So yeah, different studies have different definitions of what a community is. And the reason for that is that it's actually pretty hard to define, you know, where one community starts and another community ends and that kind of thing. In some cases, there is a clear division between two different community types. So that would be like over here on this left picture. We've got kind of a lake surrounded by these different valleys and mountains here. And there's clearly at least two different kinds of communities here. We've got the community of organisms that are living inside the lake here, and we've got the community of organisms that are living in the terrestrial environment. And we've got a clear division between those two kinds of communities, which is the water line. So there's like, in this case, it's pretty easy to say, okay, there's a lake community and there's this mountain community. However, if you're looking within, like, say, a terrestrial system, within, say, this mountain and valley kind of system, there's probably also more than one type of community that you could define within those systems as well, and it's just based on whatever you want to focus on for your you know, whatever you're interested in. So here I'm showing a kind of more gradual transition here. So there's different species probably of organisms living at the base of this mountain versus living at the top of this mountain. And each species might have its own sort of range of elevations at which it grows. And so the communities don't really have a well-defined demarcation in between them. But you could say that they're different communities. I mean, there's a different suite of species here at the bottom of the mountain interacting with each other than at the top of the mountain. But defining where one community switches to another kind of community can be really difficult if you've got this kind of you know, gradient of species change as you're going across some sort of environmental gradient. So other ways of kind of defining communities would be defining them by the dominant species in that community. So here I'm showing an oak hickory forest in the figure on the left. And so yeah, that's kind of defining a specific kind of community by whichever species are kind of the most dominant in that community. And so yeah, looking at the photo here, you can see it's mostly oak and hickory. And so you would describe that community as an oak hickory forest. You could also define communities by physical characteristics of the environment. So that's sort of like what we did with the lake versus the mountain. Another way would be like a hot springs community versus, you know, just a normal river. So like the water here in these hot springs are flowing and sort of contiguous with other bodies of water that are not hot springs. And so yeah, calling this a hot springs community is kind of defining it by its physical characteristics. The fact that you've got this this volcanic activity causing specific physical characteristics in that location, that would be defining the community by physical characteristics. All right. So yeah, thinking about how species are interacting with each other in a community is important as well. So some of the things that we've talked about are technically community ecology. So we've already talked a little bit about things like food webs and trophic cascades and that kind of thing. And that is community ecology as well. We're studying things at the level of a community. We're looking at all of these species that are interacting with each other. And so you could call an entire food web for a given location, you could call that a community. But you could also talk about just subsets of the interactions that are taking place in this food web and call that a community as well. So yeah, basically anytime that you're studying more than one species and how they're interacting with each other, you're studying a community, and you can define that community at any level. So it can be as small as just two species interacting with each other up to an entire food web. All right, so clearly this is kind of complicated, defining what a community is. And so there was this paper that kind of attempted to uh, provide a set of terminology that made things more clear in terms of studying groups of organisms. And yeah, this Fouth et al. 1996 paper, a lot of people are using these terms now, and so I wanted to kind of expose you to them. But yeah, so they're saying, okay, if you're studying groups of organisms, you're probably studying these groups either based on how they're using resources, where they're living, or how they're related to each other. And so yeah, we have this resources category, geography category, like where they're living, and then phylogeny, how they're related to each other. And so yeah, they came up with a set of terms that kind of relate these three categories and also combinations of those categories together. And they did that with this big Venn diagram. So we've got geography, resources, and phylogeny as the three big circles on this Venn diagram. And so yeah, the classical community is defined solely by geography. So yeah, this is the definition of community that we've kind of talked about so far. And this is a collection of species that occur in the same place at the same time, which are described by some either natural, arbitrary, or artificial boundary that whoever is doing the study has defined. So yeah, this is a collection of all the species living in the same place. Some people actually take this definition and kind of narrow it a little bit farther and only include members of a community if they interact directly with each other. And so, yeah, species must interact to be included in the community. But yeah, community is defined solely by geography. They just have to be living in the same place to be a member of a community. If you've got a group that you're interested in studying that's grouped totally based on relationships, like evolutionary relationships, that's called a taxon. So this is a phylogenetically related group of organisms, also called a clade. And that would be like a family of organisms, or in this case, the mammal order Rodentia. So that's an example of a taxon. It's just a group of related organisms. Doesn't say anything about interactions or where they're living or that kind of thing. They're just related to each other. My example of community was a Sonoran desert community. So this is the plants and animals and fungi and bacteria and everything living in that place. Taxon, we've got rodents as an example. The grouping of organisms that is just based on how they're using resources, that's called a guild. So yeah, a guild is a group of species without regard for taxonomic position, so without regard to how they're related to each other, that exploit the same class of environmental resources in a similar way. And so the example here would be granivores. That's like organisms that are eating seeds of plants. So this would be like birds and rodents and even ants and that kind of thing that are seed eaters. That would be a guild. Okay, and then you can see based on these Venn diagrams overlapping that there's going to be other kinds of groupings that involve two or more of these kinds of ways of grouping organisms together. So yeah, here if you've got a guild of organisms that are living in the same place, so they're using resources and they're living in the same place, they have the same geography, that's called a local guild. So that would be like Sonoran desert granivores. If you've got a group of phylogenetically related species living in the same place, we call that an assemblage. So this would be like Sonoran desert rodents. So they're related to each other evolutionarily, they're rodents, but they're also living in the same place, the Sonoran desert. So that's an assemblage when you've got a specific taxon for a specific community. In the middle here, when you've got a group of organisms that share resources, geography, and phylogeny, that's called an ensemble. So this is a phylogenetically related group of species that uses a similar set of resources within a specific community. So this would be like Sonoran desert granivorous rodents. So yeah, it's got resources, geography, and phylogeny all incorporated into it. There is another thing here that Fouth et al. Actually didn't have a name for. So this would be a guild So a group of organisms that's using resources the same way, but it's also related organisms. So this would be like granivorous rodents or pond breeding salamanders or that kind of thing, but they didn't actually come up with a name for that, that specific category there. Okay, so yeah, just take a look at this diagram here for a second, and then I'll kind of go over some examples of collections of organisms, and you'll have to tell me whether it's a guild or an assemblage or an ensemble or a taxon or a community. All right, first example here, we've got corvids. This is a family of birds that includes things like ravens and crows and magpies and blue jays. So what do y'all think for this one? You can type it in the chat. Is this a guild, a taxon, assemblage, community, or ensemble? All right, I am not seeing anything popping up in the chat. Let me just stop and make sure. Yeah, don't see anything. But anyway, yeah, this would be a taxon. So yeah, these birds are all members of the same phylogenetic group, the family Corvidae. Doesn't say anything about where they live or the kinds of resources they're eating or that kind of thing. So yeah, we would call this a taxon. All right, next example here. We've got butterflies of South Texas. So I'll let you think about that for just a minute, and then I'll talk about it. I see a chat here now. Oh, but it's not showing it to me. Oh wait, there it goes. All right, people are saying assemblage and community. All right, let's go back. So we've got assemblage and we've got community. All right, so they definitely live in the same place, South Texas. So you could say that it's a community. However, they also share phylogeny. These butterflies are all related to each other. So yeah, they have that phylogeny in common as well. And so at the very least, it's going to be an assemblage. You could also argue that it's an ensemble. If you know what these butterflies are using as resources. So for example, a lot of these butterflies are going to flowers and sipping nectar, and members of pollination guilds and that kind of thing. So yeah, you could call this, I would say this is either an assemblage because it's phylogenetic related and living in the same place, or it's an ensemble if you know that they're doing kind of similar things. If you're focused on the adult behavior, I would say that it's an ensemble. All of these adults are visiting flowers. However, if you're focused more on the caterpillar stages, I would say maybe it's an assemblage. I mean, they're all kind of plant feeding as caterpillars, but each of them is focused on different kinds of plants. So yeah, they're maybe using slightly different resources. So yeah, either an assemblage or ensemble, I would argue. All right, next example here, we've got pollinators of saguaro cacti. So here are some pictures. We've got a bat here, and then we've got a bird, and we've got a bunch of insects. Is this a guild, a taxon, an assemblage, a community, or an ensemble? All right, people are saying guild. I would argue that that is correct. So let's go back to this figure. So we've got, they're all using the same resources, so that's a guild. I would say it's a local guild because they're all on the saguaro cacti and where they occur in the Sonoran Desert. But yeah, that wasn't one of the choices. So yeah, of the choices that I gave you, guild would have been the best answer there. Okay, next we've got this diagram here showing all of these different organisms living in a pond. So is this a guild, a taxon, assemblage, community, or ensemble? What have we got? All right, people are saying community for this one, which is correct. Yeah, it's not a taxon. These are all things that are unrelated to each other. They're all eating different things, doing different things. So yeah, this would be a community defined solely by geography of living in this area. Okay, so with the last 10 minutes of class or so, I want to talk a little bit about one of those big questions in community ecology, which is how are communities assembled? Are they assembled together as a co-evolved superorganism, or are they assembled as a result of individual species interacting with their environment? So these are two really old ideas in ecology, and there were two famous ecologists, Clements and Gleason, that kind of differed in terms of their view of how they thought communities were mostly assembled. So here we've got the views of Clements in the early 1900s, and yeah, he was arguing that communities assemble as almost superorganisms, and that communities are groups of species that kind of work together to fill out all the niches that are available in an environment to get to a stable endpoint. And this is kind of a holistic view of communities. And if you predict that communities are kind of assembled in this way, you would kind of predict different species to kind of have similar distributions to each other. And you get different communities happening in different parts of an environmental gradient, where you get a graph where if you're graphing abundance of different species together versus some environmental gradient like latitude or altitude or something on the x-axis here. If communities are kind of co-evolved superorganisms, you get situations that look like this, where a lot of species, their distributions overlap really closely with each other, and you get different communities occurring where you kind of get transitions to different types of species living. And so yeah, you've got really easily defined communities here. So we've got community 1, 2, 3, and 4 kind of demarcated by these transitions from one type of community to another. Yeah, again, we've got an environmental gradient here. So say this is like going up the sides of a mountain, for example. We've got low altitude over here on the left and high altitude over here on the right. We know that communities change as we go from the base of a mountain to the top. So say that we're in like West Texas, for example. We've got like Big Bend National Park in the Chisos Mountains. We've got like lowland desert with creosote bush and cacti and stuff at the bottom. We kind of transition to a more shrubland as we're going up the sides of the Chisos Mountains, getting things like big agave and a lot of more shrubs and that kind of thing. And then at the tops of the mountains in the Chisos, we've got basically an oak forest up there with a bunch of different kinds of plants, other kinds of plants as well. And so yeah, you've got these clearly defined different kinds of communities, and you've got really strong, we call these ecotones, where you get a shift from one type of community to another type of community. Yeah, so that's Clement's view, is that communities are kind of co-evolved superorganisms. They've been interacting with each other over evolutionary time in such a way that they're kind of codependent on each other, and you get the communities assembling as kind of superorganisms where each species has a role to fill, a niche to fill. In contrast to that, we have the views of Gleason around the same time, early 1900s. And Gleason was arguing, no, these species are not really doing this. They're not kind of co-occurring so often together. He thought that communities were more a result of species' individual responses to their environment, and that each community is kind of a unique set of species that's just happens to develop in a particular place and time. So it's a much more individualistic view about species. So every species is just kind of interacting with its environment in a specific way. And in Gleason's view, you kind of get communities gradually shifting from one kind of community to another, such that you don't really see really well-defined borders with one type of community and another type of community. And instead, if you graph the abundance of different species versus some environmental gradient, again, let's just focus on like going up a mountain with low altitude on the left and high altitude on the right. He was like, basically each species has its own range of elevations or whatever that it's evolved for, and you kind of get individual species winking on and off as you're going along this environmental gradient. So going up the mountain here, you've got each individual species with its own kind of optimum, but they're not really co-evolved. They're not. There's no sort of real pattern here where species sort of kind of converge on having a similar kind of optimum for that environmental gradient. And instead you see individual species reacting differently to different environments. And yeah, you get this individualistic view of communities that looks like that. So yeah, the top of the mountain does have different species than the bottom of the mountain, but it's not a result of these really well-defined transitions from one community type to another. All right, so let's think about that as a group activity. So I'll split you out into breakout rooms and let you discuss this with the other people who are in the meeting here. So yeah, the two concepts of how communities kind of develop are they develop as co-evolved superorganisms, or they develop as a sum of independent species distributions. So I'd like you to think about like evidence and reasons for both of these different views. Do you think that one kind of view kind of is the more correct one, or do you think both views have some merit? So yeah, let's break out into breakout rooms. Let's see. Let's just do 2 rooms since there's only 10 people. And yeah, you can discuss this idea of Clements versus Gleason, of superorganisms versus individualistic view of communities. Which do you think is the better hypothesis and why, or do you think that both of them have merit? No, they're doing a group discussion thing. I'll be done in like a couple minutes though. All right, we only have about a minute left. So yeah, I'm not sure what you guys came up with, but we probably don't have a lot of time to discuss it. Um, I would say basically that there is pretty good evidence for both of these kinds of things, both of these kinds of patterns that I mentioned there. So having ecotones and having one kind of community being kind of separate from other kinds of communities. You do see that in nature, but you also see the more individualistic kind of view as well. So yeah, there are examples of both kinds of patterns. Here I'm just showing you two different pictures, um, these different kinds of patterns. So here we've got the sort of superorganism kind of pattern up here, where we've got really well-defined different kinds of communities here as we're going up a mountain. So you've got like a conifer forest, and like a shrubland, then a grassland, and then kind of a alpine system. And so yeah, we would get ecotones here as we're going down the mountain. Here's a similar kind of mountain with a much different pattern of species distributions, which much more looks like the individualistic point of view. So yeah, there's pretty good data that shows both kinds of patterns. And so yeah, you probably do get some situations where communities are a result of a lot of coevolution. You've got a lot of species that are codependent on each other, and so you get these kinds of patterns where they have similar, they live in the same places. Basically, they have evolved to kind of overlap with each other and be dependent on each other. But you do definitely also see the opposite pattern, where species are just kind of individually responding to the environment, and you've got kind of just gradual change from one type of community to another. All right, so yeah, that's it for today. We'll continue talking about communities on Thursday. As I mentioned, the exam 3A is just going to have the stuff about species interactions on it. So up to the end of the mutualism and commensalism material, that'll be where the material for that exam stops. All right, thanks. Send me an email if you have any questions. If you're watching this at 3, or later in the afternoon, be sure to join that that office hours. If you have any questions, you can ask them live to me then as well. And I'll see y'all on Thursday. Bye, Carolyn. Someone has a chat question. Let's see. For the last slide, does the top picture represent the superorganism? Yes. So yeah, that top slide is definitely more the pattern that's associated with this holistic superorganism view of Clements here, where we've got different kinds of communities and really obvious transitions between them. Exactly. All right. Y'all have a good week, and I'll see y'all on Thursday.